All right. Good morning, everyone. So we have this week the Torah portion of Chukas. And in this week's Torah portion, we have the famous story of Moses hitting the rock. That's what we are going to deal with in this week's Torah portion. So in this week's Torah portion, the Torah tells the story how Miriam, Moshe's sister, Moses' older sister.
Did he have other siblings? I mean, besides Aaron and Miriam?
Oh, just three of them. How Moses' older sister, Miriam, she passed away. And when she passed away, what happened is their water supply, the Jewish people, their water supply basically dried up. Because the water supply that the Jewish people had in the desert was given to them in the merit of Miriam. I don't know what's happening with this. There we go. The water supply that the Jewish people had was given to them in the merit of Miriam, which means throughout the 40 years that the Jewish people were in the desert, they had water. It was kind of like a traveling rock that would travel with them. And this rock would give them water. So what happened in this week's Torah portion from the book of Numbers, the Torah tells us that the Israelites arrived at the wilderness of Zin. And it was the first month. And they were in a place called Kadesh. And Miriam died over there, and that's where she was buried. After she passed away, as I mentioned to you, this miraculous water supply that the Jewish people had been given stopped providing water. So now there was no water for them. So people came to Moshe and to Aaron, and they quarreled, and they said, "What are you doing to us? We're in the desert, and we have no water. Now we're going to die. Why have you done this to us? We could have been in Egypt." And everything is... everyone is freaking out, right? So what happens? Hashem comes to Moshe, and God tells Moses, "I want you to go to the rock, and I want you to take your stick with you, and I want you to speak to the rock. And when you speak to the rock, it's going to give out water in front of everyone." Right? Familiar with that story?
He didn't hit it?
So he did. So what happened? Moshe goes to the rock, and he takes the stick just as God has commanded him, and everybody over there is gathered, and he says to the people, do you think that we can get water out of this rock? And Moshe raised his hand and he struck the rock twice with his staff. And out of this rock came copious amounts of water, and the community and their beasts drank. So God instructed Moses that he should speak to the rock. And instead of speaking to the rock, Moses hit the rock. And as a result of that, God punishes Moses and tells him that now he won't be able to go into the land of Israel. See that on the screen or on the paper. It says God punishes Moses and tells him that as a result of that action, he's not going to go into the land of Israel. "Because you did not trust in me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelite people, therefore you shall not lead this congregation into the land that I have given them." Those are the waters of quarreling, meaning that the Israelites quarreled with God, whose sanctity was affirmed through them.
So is he saying is God saying that Moses didn't trust him because Moses, instead of talking to the rock, hit the rock?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what it was?
Yep. That was the sin. The sin was that instead of speaking to the rock, he hit the rock. And also Hashem was telling him that Moses was supposed to sanctify God's name by speaking to the rock, and instead he hit the rock. Now, if I'm reading your expression correctly, you want to know what's the big deal, right?
Yeah, which commandment, which 613 commandments say thou shalt not hit a rock?
Right. It's not one of the 613 commandments. But in a way, it's worse because it was a specific, deliberate commandment to Moses himself that says, "Speak to the rock." It's like if you get up in front of the judge, and the judge wants to know why you hit your kid. You're like, I know I was supposed to speak to my kid, but I whacked him instead. It's not such a big deal, right?
This whole story.
That would be a big deal. I'm just messing around. But when it's a rock, it's a bit different.
Yeah, I didn't say that to the judge.
Don't say that.
This story of water coming out of the rock is almost symptomatic of modern day Israel in a way. I mean, here you have this crappy piece of land with nothing, and all of a sudden you're growing vegetation.
Absolutely, especially if you look at, when
you're in the Negev and whatever. And
when the Jewish people were expelled from their own land in the Gaza Strip, Gush Katif, you see the greenhouses that they had built, which the Arabs just tore down and burnt. But it was incredible what they had built, and just absolutely land that no one was able to do 100%. The idea of bringing water from a rock is extremely symbolic. It's symbolic of the land. It's symbolic of people. It's symbolic of it's not the first time that water came out of the rock. They had water coming out of the rock during the lifetime of Miriam as well. Just when she passed, the water stopped. And the people were thirsty, so Moses had to cause the water to come out again. I'm assuming we're going to touch on some of the things that you're mentioning now, but there's definitely, yes, the idea of a rock, a dry rock, being able to give water, and the method by which we pull the water out is definitely going to be very strongly related. When we have a land, when we have a person that is seemingly a rock, they're seemingly cold, they're hard, what methods need to be used to provide, to get them to bring out water? So here's the Rebbe, and the Rebbe asks the question, seemingly we need to have clarification. Why is this matter so severe to the extent that Moshe was punished not to be allowed to enter the land of Israel? Thank you. There are other instances in which Moses seemingly behaved in an undesirable manner. There's a story of Moses neglected to circumcise his son, Eliezer. He was judged with a death sentence until his wife Zipporah took a flint and performed the surgery. Another example is when Moshe said, could enough flocks and herds be slaughtered to suffice them? He spoke badly about the Jewish people, and other such examples. So the question that the Rebbe is asking is, why is it so bad? In other words, okay, Moses didn't follow God's instruction to the letter of the law. Instead of speaking to the rock, he hit the rock. There's a problem over here, granted, but why was the punishment so severe? Not to go into the land of Israel, that's a pretty big one, right? That was everything that Moses had dreamed about, is taking the people into the land of Israel, and so on. We're going to just skip these sources over here about Moses not giving his son a circumcision.
2,000 years later, Machiavelli would have said, well, the end justifies the means.
Does it? Oh, he's saying because he got water?
He got water, yeah. He got water.
I guess God didn't agree.
It's his game.
He makes the rules. I'm skipping to over there where it says. So if you look through the Torah, you will find other areas where Moses didn't follow. He didn't do exactly what he was supposed to. The two examples being what we just mentioned. He was supposed to circumcise his son and he didn't, and he almost died as a result of that. Or he spoke badly about the Jewish people. But in neither of those two cases did God say, you're unfit to take the Jewish people into the land of Israel. Now, when God says, speak to the rock, and instead he hits the rock, and as John pointed out, accomplished the same goal. The rock still gave water. Over there, God says to him, okay, now you're not going. So again, the Rebbe's question is, what was so severe about the sin that Hashem punished him that he wouldn't go into the land of Israel? So let's see. True, Hashem had told Moses to speak to the rock, and he hit it with his staff instead. But this still requires explanation. Is the difference between hitting and speaking so great to warrant this punishment? Furthermore, his failure to follow God's instructions can be understood, since a mistake was made and Moses was speaking to the wrong rock and no water was coming out. The Jewish people had begun to express doubt. Moses therefore decided to strike the rock, knowing that he had been instructed to do similarly in an earlier episode. Strike the rock and water will issue forth. So let me explain over here. What happened over here is that Moshe went, found the rock, or at least what he thought was the rock, and he began to speak to the rock as God has instructed him to do. However, the rock wasn't producing water. So all of the Jewish people were freaking out because there's no water. Without water, and everyone's going to die, right? They're in the desert. And Moses, their beloved leader, came to do what Hashem wants. And he is speaking to the rock, but nothing's happening. So after Moses speaks to the rock, turns out he had made a mistake and he was talking to the wrong rock. But either way, he was speaking to the rock and all of the people were watching and they saw no water coming out. So what did he do? He hit the rock. Why did he hit the rock? Because earlier on in the Torah, in Exodus, let's see that at the bottom over there. In Exodus, that means early on, the beginning of the 40 years, also the Jewish people had no water. And at that point, when the Jewish people asked God, when Moses asked God what to do, Hashem told him to strike the rock. So it's not like he pulled this idea of hitting a rock out of a hat. He kind of reverted back to that which he had tried earlier. So this is Exodus 17, verse 5 and 6. In an earlier instances, God had said to Moses, pass before the people, take with you some of the elders, and take along the staff. I will be standing there before you on the rock. Strike the rock and water will come out. So, and to make things even stronger, in our Torah portion, and this week from Bamidbar, God clearly told him, I want you to take your staff along with you. Right? Remember that? So why would he need to take his stick along if he wasn't going to be hitting the rock? So if you kind of take into consideration all of these different details, we're just building the question over here. Seems a little harsh that his punishment was that he wasn't going to go into the land of Israel, because God told him to speak to the rock. Hashem told him, take your stick and go speak to the rock. So he takes his stick, he speaks to the rock, there's nothing happening. Everyone is freaking out. So he pulls out his stick and he hits the rock, because A, in an earlier instance, God had told him to hit the rock, and B, God had instructed him to take the stick with him. So why wouldn't he do that if not for the fact that he was supposed to hit the rock? By the way, this stick wasn't just any stick. This was a special staff that had been passed from Adam, the first man, to Noah and to Shem, throughout all the different great leaders. Eventually, this comes from the Medrash. Eventually, this stick landed up with Joseph. And from Joseph, it went into the possession of Pharaoh and his palace. They took possession over it. And Jethro, it's an interesting story, just so I'll slow down for a second. So this staff that Moses was holding, he performed miracles with the staff. That's when it turned into a snake, and he did all the miracles, etc. So this was his stick. So the Medrash tells us this stick was a very special stick. It originated with Adam, made its way down all the way till Joseph. Joseph died, and it landed up in Pharaoh's estate. Now, there was a man called Jethro that originally he was one of Pharaoh's magicians, one of Pharaoh's advisors. So when Jethro found the stick, kind of working in Pharaoh's court, he took it for himself. And when he ran away from Egypt, he went to Midian, he planted it in his garden, and miraculously it was stuck inside and nobody was ever able to take it out. Now, you all know that story that Moses ran away from Egypt because Pharaoh wanted to kill him, and he ran to Midian as well. And when he came to Jethro's house, because he married Jethro's daughter, he saw the stick, and he, being the great man that he was, he recognized that there was greatness to the stick, and he reached out to take the stick, and the stick came out.
The sword and the stone.
Exactly. Everything comes from the Torah, even all the movies, everything. Where's the sword and the stone from?
Merlin the magician and King Arthur. And
everything comes from Torah.
Disney movie. Yeah.
Disney movie.
So you talk about water coming from a rock. If you have manna coming from heaven, sustenance, where's the water?
The water from the rock.
Yeah, I mean, if one's coming from the, you would think, well, if the food's coming down, the water would come down.
So you're right. For 40 years, the Jewish people were in desert. They had a rock that, it was a rock that traveled with them. And wherever the rock went, whenever they went, they took the rock with them. And then it was called the Be'ero Shel Miriam, the well of Miriam. And this rock just constantly produced water for anyone who wanted.
So they were able to hand that stick down from Adam all the way down to Moses.
All the way till Joseph. From Joseph, it landed up in Pharaoh's court. From Pharaoh, landed up in Jethro. And then when Moses had arrived in Midian, he took it from Jethro. And that's one of the reasons why Yisro was willing to give Moses his daughter, because Jethro understood that the man who's taking the stick is a special person, and he's going to eventually redeem the Jewish people from Egypt. So he gave Moses his daughter Tzipporah as a wife.
So they can keep track of a stick through all those generations, but yet they can't find Mount Sinai.
That's right. Whatever Hashem wants to be kept secret is kept secret.
Tying into yesterday's Torah portion, see, Korach came along at the wrong time. If he had come along after this,
How about now? Any better?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Yes.
That was part of it. Just John was mentioning the fact that in yesterday's Torah portion, Korach came along, and Korach could have come after this story because he could have had more ammunition against Moshe, which is true, and very interesting thing that you point out. Because one of the reasons why Korach was able to get the traction that he was able to get is because Korach came after the story of the spies. So everything had just gone haywire. Everything had just broken down. The Jewish people originally were supposed to spend only a year or two in the desert and go into the land of Israel. From last week's Torah portion to this week's Torah portion, we've fast forwarded like many, many years. So Korach came along after the story of the spies, and people were very confused, resentful, upset at the situation, because at the end of the day, and I mentioned this yesterday, right, they chose to blame the leadership because we're supposed to be 1 or 2 years in the desert. Now there's this whole story of the spies, and now we're stuck in the desert for 40 years. So there was a tremendous amount of built up tension and animosity, and Korach found the opportunity to blame it on Moses. He turned to people, he said, look, Moses is the leader, and he's not getting us where we want. So you do raise a good point. All right, before we answer the question, like all good Jewish questions, and
You're silent again. You're mute.
all right, we're just going to go back to the built-in microphone, even though the sound's not as good. So to answer this question, we're going to go back. We're going to talk about something seemingly unrelated, and we'll come back and see how, of course, it is related. So I want to tell you a story about the previous Chabad Rebbe. The previous Chabad Rebbe lived in Russia, of course, and the Communist Party came to power in 1917, and the Communist power devoted itself, amongst other things, to a war against religion. They wanted to do away with any form of religion. And if they didn't like religion, Judaism was on the top of their list of what they didn't like. And they created a special party within the Communist Party called the Yivasektia. And this was run and operated by Jews. So they knew the ins and the outs, and they knew where to look and how to, and this was a group that was dedicated to undermining and to getting rid of Judaism, run by Jews. Now, while all of this was taking place, the previous Rebbe, whose name was Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, was the leader, was the Rebbe of Chabad, and he began establishing a network of secret underground Jewish institutions. So schools that would operate in secret, mikvahs, synagogues, kosher food, matzah, everything, black market, clandestine, under the radar as much as they could. And that's what he was busy with, trying to keep Judaism alive in Russia. Now, they were onto him because they knew that he was the power behind this whole thing. And in 1927, he was arrested, and his arrest, originally was given a punishment. The decree was that he would be put to death. It was the capital death penalty. That's what, and eventually that was kind of lowered from a death sentence to exile, and eventually exile was taken as well, and he was expelled from Russia in 1927.
But it was that whole network that the Rebbe was supporting, like you said, under the radar and whatever, which is why the Rebbe, number 7, was against all the Soviet Jewry protest.
Yes.
Because he thought it could upset what was already in place.
Yes. John raises a very interesting point, and it's connected, but not directly connected, is that during the 60s,
early 70s.
Early 70s, there was Jews in America, Jews in Russia were still stuck there. And Jews in America kind of had different approaches as to how they were going about trying to help the Jews. And there was a big camp that felt that open demonstrations, even some force or some violence was kind of the answer to helping Soviet Jewry. And the Rebbe was of the opposite opinion, that it should all be quiet and so on and so forth. And basically what John is pointing out is that very interesting, is that during what started in the 20s continued into the 50s and the 60s, Jews were operating these underground synagogues and everything like that. And the Rebbe felt very strongly that if the Jews in America are going to be making too much noise, they're actually going to be hurting the existing operations that existed in Russia. So for all of the help that they thought they were giving the Jews in Russia, they were in fact making things worse for them. But yes, that was kind of the continuation or the outgrowth of that which the previous Rebbe started after, communism came to power. So 1927, the previous Rebbe was arrested, and he sat through interrogations. They wanted to get information out of him. They wanted him to incriminate himself. And the previous Rebbe, who, by the way, wrote a diary about this time that he was in prison. So he himself wrote a diary, very, very detailed diary, not only of what happened to him, but he writes about his thought process as well. And he writes over there that they tried to intimidate him, and he made a decision not to give in. To the point, for example, they would ask him questions, and he refused to respond in Russian. Everything he answered them in in Yiddish. And by the way, many of them understood Yiddish. He writes in his own diary that the two arresting officers were both Jewish, part of this group called the Yivasektia. And in some cases, in one case, he was a descendant, one of them, of a chassid. So the arresting officer was a descendant of be it as it may, they were very frustrated with him because he was extremely stubborn. At one point, they asked him, "Do you know where you are?" And the previous Rebbe answered, "I'm in a place that would not require a mezuzah." That's like saying, like in a bathroom, like it's a place of impurity. So at one point, one of his interrogating officers picked up a gun and they waved the gun in his face. And they told him, he said, this toy has made many people that didn't want to speak, has made them speak. Basically, if you don't tell us we want to tell you, we're going to kill you. So the previous Rebbe was very firm. He didn't give in to the intimidation. And he said as follows. He said, that toy can only intimidate a person who has one world and many gods. But me, I have one God and many worlds, or two worlds, and I'm not afraid of that. I'm going to repeat what I said. He said to them, that toy can only intimidate a person who has many gods, but one world.
One word?
World.
World.
W-O-R-L-D.
Sorry.
But me, that I have only one God, but more than one world. If you kill me, my soul will still, right? My soul's still going to live. I'm not afraid of that. I'm not afraid of your toy. And as I mentioned to you before, eventually he was released, sent into exile. After only 9 days of exile, he was released from exile as well. And eventually was released completely. So, what were you going to say?
So what I was going to say is, until I read this book, I never had any idea that there were Jews in Russia who basically were just like the Germans in the Nazi period, as far as, this guy,
Leon is
Kaganovich.
Leon is nodding his head, and Leon is born and raised in.
Yeah, this guy Kaganovich was in charge basically of the starvation in the Ukraine and the millions and millions. And he never repented. The Rebbe tried to get him to, one way or the other, but it's just, you don't think of Jewish people and those kind of things.
They were the brains behind communism.
Well, sure, Trotsky and you're right. But
Wasn't that daughter that ran off with a Cossack in, with Tevye, that whole story, wasn't that daughter when he couldn't accept it? Wasn't that the whole deal, that it was communism?
I don't know. I'll have to rewatch further on. Get back to you.
Yeah, you will.
But yes, the story is common that Jewish men and Jewish women ran off with the communists and they turned against their own people.
well,
Right.
and similar thing in New York in the early 1900s. There were Jews who were head of and involved very heavily in all these labor unions and all the unrest in New York. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you more. There were Jews who were shoving other Jewish people in ovens, helping Hitler, Nazis. There were those kind of Jews too. They went to the ovens as well themselves afterwards, but for a while they were helping Nazis.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Wow, that's heavy.
Unfortunately, we have no shortage of enemies from the inside and from the outside. And what their calculation is, if they thought they were going to save themselves, who knows? So getting back to the story over here, the previous Rebbe was sitting in jail, and it was a Thursday that they came and told to him that your death sentence has been removed. So it was a Thursday. That's important over here. The third day of the month of Tammuz. They told him your death sentence has been removed, and we're going to send you now by train to a very far away place called Kostroma, far into the depths of Russia, and you're going to be in exile over there. So when they came and they told him that, as I told you, it was on a Thursday, he was given permission to go home and meet his family for 6 hours until he would have to be by the train station and travel. But when he was told that the trip that he was going to take was going to leave by train on Thursday, he would travel by train Thursday, Friday, and he would arrive on Shabbos in the location that he was supposed to arrive. He said, under no circumstances am I getting on that train. You understand? He refused to leave prison and to get on that train because he did not want to arrive on Shabbos. Now, to explain, according to the law, as you mentioned earlier, his life was under the most dire, dangerous circumstances. Of course, he was allowed to travel. If one asked, what's the law say? His life is in danger. To stay an extra second in prison is life threatening. But the previous Rebbe said, I would rather stay in prison an extra 3 days, and I'll leave on Sunday, but I'm not leaving today if it means that I'm going to have to travel on Shabbos. And the Rebbe questions this. What's going on over here? How can the previous Rebbe do that? You're allowed to break Shabbos. Not only are you allowed to break Shabbos, you have to break Shabbos if somebody's life is in danger. Even if you have a doubt, maybe somebody's life is in danger, you have to break Shabbos. So why did the previous Rebbe refuse to travel on this train, which would have definitely been a lifesaver for him if, what's the problem? Why he's allowed to travel?
But saving the life, what's the
Pikuach nefesh.
Yes. Because isn't that an exception where if you're going to save a life, you can do it?
Not only you can, you have to.
Right.
Which raises the question, why wouldn't he travel?
Right.
His life was in danger.
So were you going to relate that when the Rebbe was released or was told he could leave prison on the 3rd of Tammuz is a similar story to your Tish B'Av story?
Why is it similar to the Tisha B'Av story?
Well, because the next Rebbe died on the 3rd of Tammuz.
Yeah, that's all right. John is pointing out something interesting, that the 3rd day of the Hebrew month of Tammuz, which was yesterday, in the previous Rebbe's life, that landed up being the day that his death sentence was taken off from him, and he was given the news that he would be sent into exile. But it was great news at the time because it was the beginning of his redemption. And then many years later, on the 3rd of Tammuz in 1994, that's the day that the Rebbe passed. So there's some deep connection over here, something obviously going on with the 3rd of Tammuz. So we'll have to marinate in that thought a little bit. But the Rebbe, it's definitely something over there. So I'm skipping a bunch of pages.
Sorry.
No,
That's okay. Just tell me what page.
I don't know, mine and yours might be slightly different.
16.
No, mine and yours are going to be different.
That's
Wait.
okay. You go ahead.
Where it says international publicity.
Okay, I'll find it.
One more.
Yeah.
So the question is a big question. Why did the previous Rebbe refuse to get on the train? You can look at it from so many different perspectives and see that breaking Shabbos, there was a chance he wouldn't have broken Shabbos. There was all sorts of different ways that he could have worked it and he could have used it, but he adamantly refused, even if there was a small chance that he might break Shabbos. So the Rebbe explains that when there is a case of sanctifying God's name or doing the opposite, there's no room for any other consideration. Had the Rebbe agreed to leave prison despite being told that he would have to arrive on Shabbos, even if he would have eventually been successful to change the plan and avoid perhaps traveling on Shabbos, the very fact that he agreed to leave prison knowing that he would have to travel on Shabbos would have caused the desecration of God's name. In other words, he was worried about how it would be perceived, because there's this idea of sanctifying God's name, or the opposite, desecrating God's name. His captors would have bragged about their success in forcing the Rebbe to leave prison with the knowledge that he would have to travel on Shabbos. This is what the Rebbe was endangering his life for, because this was a matter of sanctifying God's name. So the previous Rebbe understood that there's more at play over here. Yes, technically his life was in danger, and there was permission from the Torah. Jewish law allows you to travel on Shabbos, but he understood that there's a way that this is going to be perceived. There's an interpretation that this is going to be given by his enemies, by his captors. And he did not want that they should have the satisfaction of knowing that they forced him to travel on Shabbos. So he understood that what's at play over here is sanctifying God's name. Everyone should know that the previous Rebbe said that I'm not going to travel on Shabbos. And in fact, this idea of sanctifying God's name, the Rambam tells us it is mandatory upon the whole house of Israel to sanctify the great name. Each one of us have an instruction. We have a commandment to sanctify God's name in however that looks in our lives, to make sure that the world and the people around us see us sanctifying God's name. So even if there's an idea that we're asked to transgress a small little sin, which technically you don't have to give your life away for it, but if it's going to cause a great desecration of God's name, then we are expected to give our life away. So a person is expected to be willing to give their life away if by desecrating something, they're going to cause a great, what's called a chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name. So now we can kind of get back to this idea of hitting the rock. When it came to hitting the rock, we asked, why was Moses punished so severely when it came to hitting the rock? And one of the ways of seeing this is that the difference between, for example, the story of Moses not giving his son a circumcision versus this idea of Moses hitting the rock is that this was now in public. When Moses didn't give his son a circumcision, and for that he almost died, that was a private incident. And there's a big difference between that which takes place in private versus that which takes place in public in this regard about what's a sanctification of God's name. So the Rebbe says that this is also the explanation of the severity of hitting the rock. This action was associated with sanctifying God's name, or the reverse. All of the Jewish people are standing there and watching. And that's why the Torah says that God told Moses, because you did not believe in me and sanctify me in front of the Jewish people, this is why, and that's what God told him. God told me, you didn't sanctify me in front of all these people. And that's why this sin is worse than all the other sins. All the other sins that Moses did, not all the other, but the other incidents that seemingly Moses did something wrong, they were small private incidents. They didn't concern. But here Moses had the opportunity of sanctifying God's name. Now, just to be clear, our intention is not to elaborate on Moses' mistakes, but rather the point of what we're trying to bring out of here is just to emphasize the importance of sanctifying God's name. So when it comes to sanctifying God's name, that is such an important issue, and that's the severity of what happened over here with Moses. All of the Jewish people were gathered around, and had Moses spoken to the rock the way Hashem had originally instructed him to, that would have created a tremendous sanctification of God's name. All of the Jewish people would have seen, rocks don't give water. God instructed me to speak to the rock. I'm going to speak to the rock. But then when Moses told the Jewish people, God told me to speak to the rock, and now it's not working, and he hits the rock, there's a breakdown here of the sanctification of God's name. Everybody knew that Moses was supposed to speak to the rock, and then he goes and he hits the rock. So what we're suggesting is one of the reasons why Moses was punished so severely is because of the importance of sanctifying God's name. what we do in public, how our actions are perceived, and the sanctification, or God forbid, the opposite, the desecration of God's name, is a very important important idea. And we saw that from the previous Rebbe's life. The previous Rebbe was willing to stay in jail for another 3 days just so he shouldn't travel on Shabbos, because he knew, he was concerned about how that was going to be interpreted.
But isn't this redundant when God said, because you didn't listen to me, you're not going to live to enter the land of Canaan, when it had already been said that everybody who left Egypt, no one is going to be alive to enter
Good
Israel.
question. Good question. At that point, Moses was an exception, because, and he wasn't the only exception. There was a few exceptions. For example, Yehoshua, Joshua was an exception. Caleb was an exception. So it was 98% of them that weren't going to enter, with a few exceptions, and everybody thought that Moses was going to be one of those exceptions. You know what I'm saying? So you're right. There was this decree that everybody wasn't going to enter the land of Israel, but Moses, they thought, would be an exception. I want to tell you a beautiful story, and just this idea about the importance of sanctifying God's name. So Sir Winston Churchill, you ever heard about him? The great prime minister of Great Britain, died in 1965. And when he died in 1965, so countries from around the world dispatched their ambassadors, their leaders, the finest, to go and be there for his funeral. So Israel at the time sent their prime minister, whose name was, I'm sorry, not their prime minister, their president. In Israel, the prime minister is the highest and the president is underneath him. You know that. The Rosh HaMemshalah, the head of the country, is called the prime minister, and the president is like the vice, what we would have in America, the vice president.
I thought it was the other way, but I thought the president was basically ceremonial.
It's an important role, but in Israel, the prime minister really controls the Knesset. I mean, he has the majority behind him. So the president at the time was a man called Zalman Shazar. Ever heard of President Zalman Shazar of Israel? That was his name. Now, Churchill's funeral took place on Shabbat, and President Shazar was refused to travel by car on Shabbat. So as a result, Shazar and a man that he was with, Ben Gurion, who also came over there, they walked by foot from their hotel to the funeral, which was a significant distance. I don't know exactly how far it was.
From Plano to Frisco.
Don't think it was that far. They walked. Now, on Shabbos, the Queen of England at that time hosted a reception at Buckingham Palace for all of these great world leaders that had come to participate in the funeral. And the palace, maybe that was as far, was a few more miles from their hotel where Shazar was staying. So his staff told the palace that he would not be attending because he doesn't travel on Shabbos and the distance is too far to walk. So when the palace heard this and the queen found out, she was very upset, and she called the embassy in London, listen to this, and she told the embassy in London that she's very upset to hear that President Shazar cannot come to Buckingham Palace because he's not able to ride a car on Shabbos. And so therefore she's offering to send her royal horse-drawn carriage, that it should be available to pick him up at his hotel, and he will be brought to the palace via the Queen's horse-drawn carriage. So the ambassador politely explained that the prohibition of traveling on Shabbos applies not only to modern engine-powered vehicles, but also a horse-drawn carriage you can't use. So the palace still didn't want to give up, and they told him that they would send a boat I don't know the geography of London well enough to tell you, but somehow they would send a small boat from the Royal Navy, and they would take him to the palace via the Thames River, you know, or the Thames. Sorry, I knew I had no idea. Thames. So there's
It's a British thing.
a British thing. I'm from South Africa, but so of course the ambassador told him, appreciate it so much, but he can't come, and apologized in the name of the president, you know, that he wasn't going to be able to be there. Now, what's interesting about this story is that Shazar himself was not Sabbath observant. It's not like every week that he was in Israel, he refused to get in a car. He was seen in cars on more than one occasion in the land of Israel, but he understood that as a representative of the land of Israel, of the country of the Jewish people, you know, before we were talking about how Jews kind of represent sometimes ourselves in a good light and sometimes in a bad light, but he understood that as a representative of the Jewish people, it was incumbent upon him. He had to make a sanctification of God's name, and he had to represent the Jewish people in such a way to not travel, not in a car, not in a carriage, not in a boat, because it was Shabbos. And of course, the lesson for all of us is, you know, from Moses hitting the rock, we're not Moses, we're not the previous Rebbe, probably not Shazar either, but the reality is that the Jew always has to be aware of how he's being perceived. Why? Because we have the responsibility and we have the opportunity to sanctify God's name. And that's a great an honor and a responsibility that we have. And that was the big deal about Moses hitting the rock. At least this is one perspective, that he lost an opportunity to sanctify God's name in front of the Jewish people. It's not only in front of non-Jews, Jews, non-Jews. And the lesson that we have, obviously, is this idea of taking into consideration that all of our actions have the ability to sanctify God's name.